In today's tutorial, we're going to be discussing the 5-act structure of Macbeth and how an understanding of that structure is important when you're writing your assignments and exam answers, because examiners are particularly interested in those students who can relate their understanding of the characters and the themes and the events to the structure that Shakespeare writes his play in, the 5-act structure. Now, I think one of the best ways of understanding the 5-act structure is to link it to a theory of narrative and storyline, which was formulated by a chap called Todorov. Now, I don't know a great deal about Todorov himself, but he noticed that most storylines, most narratives, tend to conform to a particular structure, in that events tend to happen in quite a predictable and formulaic way when you scrutinise and look at narratives in detail. And it's linking Shakespeare's 5-act structure to Todorov's narrative theory that I'm going to do for you in this tutorial. Todorov identified that all storylines begin in a state of what is called equilibrium. So that's part one of the narrative structure, equilibrium. Now, equilibrium simply means order and balance. Most stories start with everything being perfectly okay. In Macbeth, that is true to some extent. We begin the play with the witches, which would have been very unnerving to Shakespeare's original audience. But after we've had the witches, we find ourselves in a scene in which 2 battles have just been fought in Scotland, the final battle of a civil war and rebellion, and a battle repelling invaders from Norway. So when we join the main action of the play, order, balance, equilibrium has just been restored in Scotland. The second phase of Todorov's narrative theory suggests that after the equilibrium, there comes the second phase, the problem. Now, of course, that's pretty obvious if you think about it. If everything in a story goes along as it always has done, then you haven't actually got a story. You need a problem to come into the story in order to get the narrative going. I would suggest that the main problem phase of Macbeth begins in Act 2 when Macbeth kills Duncan. Prior to that, he's been dithering and hesitating about whether or not he's going to do it, but when he actually kills King Duncan, that's when the problem phase really begins. The third phase of Todorov's narrative structure suggests that we then move into what is known as the chaos phase. And if you look at Act 3 of Macbeth, that certainly fulfills that label of chaos phase, because at the start of Act 3, Macbeth is crowned King of Scotland, and almost immediately after that, as a terrible ruler, a tyrannical ruler, he plunges Scotland into a state of chaos, where people are dying and living terrible lives under his tyrannical rule. So Act 3 of Macbeth actually conforms very closely to Todorov's narrative theory that suggests that the third stage of any storyline should be the phase of chaos. Now, in order to kickstart the story, as we've said, there has to be a problem. So inevitably, towards the conclusion of the story, you're going to have the fourth phase, which is known as the solution. Now, in Macbeth, I would suggest that the solution straddles 2 acts, Acts 4 and 5. Because in Act 4, we have the first stage of the solution, which is when Macduff meets up with Malcolm, the late King Duncan's eldest son, and formulates a plan and helps get an army together to march on Scotland and take the throne from Macbeth. The second part of the solution comes towards the end of Act 5, when, in battle, Macduff kills Macbeth, thereby getting rid of the play's main problem, which is Macbeth as the villain and the disorder and the chaos. Once the solution has been applied, we then move into what Todorov described in the fifth and final stage as the new equilibrium. Now remember, equilibrium means balance and order, and that is indeed what happens at the end of Macbeth. In my previous tutorial, I was telling you about tragedy as a dramatic genre and what a play has to be in order to conform to the rules, if you like, the genre rules of a tragedy. Now, sometimes in class, when I ask people, what do you think a tragedy is? Someone inevitably will answer, it's a play that ends unhappily, but that's not actually the truth. Most tragedies, or should I say many tragedies, tend to have a happy ending, because once the tragedy is over, a new equilibrium, a new order and a new balance is restored. At the end of Macbeth, when Macduff kills Macbeth in battle, that then allows the rightful heir to the throne, Malcolm, Duncan's elder son, to become King of Scotland. And in Malcolm's final speech of the play, the very last lines tell us that now that the battle is over, he will go off to be crowned as Scotland's rightful ruler. So a new order is restored at the end. Another reason why it's called the new equilibrium, the new order, is because by the end of the play, there will have been a lot of change. You have to have change in a narrative, in a story. And so by the end of the play, things have changed. One of the most obvious, of course, is that a number of characters who were alive at the beginning of the play are now dead. Circumstances have changed. So that's why the fifth and final phase of Todorov's narrative theory is called the new equilibrium, the new order and the new balance, and that is certainly what has happened by the end of Act 5 in Macbeth. In our next tutorial, we will start our analysis of the actual play, so make sure that you've got a copy of the script in front of you to follow, because we will be reading it through line by line, and I'll be explaining and analysing as we go.